The plasma cannon's heat signature painted the asteroid field in deadly blues and greens as Captain Sarah Chen adjusted her targeting matrix. Around her, the bridge of the UES Defiance hummed with controlled chaos. Her crew worked with practiced efficiency, their movements sharp and purposeful, despite the 3-day running battle that had pushed them all to their limits. Vraktar warships closing on Vector 77 Mark IV, reported Lieutenant Morrison, his voice steady despite the exhaustion etched across his features. They're trying to flank us through the debris field. Sarah's fingers danced across her command console, calculating trajectories and probabilities with the kind of intuitive mathematics that had made her legendary among both human and alien forces. The Vraktar were formidable opponents, their crystalline ships capable of withstanding punishment that would reduce most vessels to floating scrap. But they had one weakness that Sarah had learned to exploit during her 5 years of frontline combat. They thought in straight lines. Helm, take us into the asteroid cluster at bearing 215. Engineering, I need every ounce of power you can squeeze from the fusion cores. Weapons, prepare the kinetic penetrators for sequential firing pattern Delta 7. The bridge shuddered as another Vraktar energy beam grazed their shields. Warning lights cast an amber glow across the crew's faces, but nobody flinched. They had learned to trust their captain's seemingly impossible maneuvers. Where other commanders saw certain death, Sarah Chen saw opportunity. Captain, that trajectory will take us directly into the asteroid field's densest region, warned Commander Torres, her first officer. Our shields won't hold if we impact one of those rocks at this velocity. Sarah's smile was predatory. The Vraktar shields won't hold either, but we're smaller, more maneuverable, and we have something they don't. What's that, Captain? A human pilot who learned to fly in Earth's asteroid belt before the Galactic Council deemed it too dangerous for training exercises. The Defiance dove into the swirling chaos of rock and ice, its hull singing with the stress of constant course corrections. Behind them, 3 Vraktar heavy cruisers followed, their commanders too proud to abandon the pursuit. Sarah watched their formation on the tactical display, noting how they maintained their rigid triangular attack pattern, even in the confined space. Predictable. Weapons, lock onto the lead cruiser. Wait for my mark. Sarah's hands moved across her controls, plotting a course that would take them behind a massive, slowly rotating asteroid. The Vraktar ships adjusted their heading to intercept just as she had calculated they would. Torres, remember the Battle of Kepler Station? When Admiral Harrison pulled that impossible maneuver against the hegemony fleet, her first officer's eyes widened with understanding. You're going to use the asteroid as a gravitational slingshot, not just any slingshot. Watch this. The Defiance skimmed the asteroid's surface so closely that loose rocks bounced off their deflector screens. Sarah's piloting was flawless, using the massive object's rotation and gravity to accelerate beyond what their engines alone could achieve. The Vraktar ships, locked into their pursuit pattern, couldn't match the maneuver without breaking formation. That's when Sarah struck. Fire all kinetic penetrators. Target their shield generators. The specially designed projectiles, moving at near relativistic speeds thanks to their gravitational boost, punched through the lead Vraktar ship's shields as if they were paper. Secondary explosions rippled across its crystalline hull as critical systems overloaded. Direct hits across their primary systems. The lead ship is dead in space, reported the weapons officer. But Sarah wasn't finished. Using the asteroid field's complex gravitational interactions, she spun the Defiance through a series of impossible turns that would have liquefied any crew not protected by inertial dampeners. The remaining Vraktar ships, now desperate to escape the trap they had flown into, found themselves herded like cattle toward a cluster of particularly large asteroids. Captain, incoming transmission from the Vraktar fleet commander, announced the communications officer. Put it through. The main screen flickered to life, revealing the insectoid features of a Vraktar warrior caste leader. His mandibles clicked in what Sarah had learned to recognize as grudging respect. Human Chen, the alien's translated voice carried through the bridge speakers. Your tactics are unconventional. We acknowledge your victory in this engagement. Just doing my job, Commander Zethkari. Tell your hierarchy that the Terran Defense Force isn't backing down from any system they want to claim. The alien's compound eyes glittered. Your reputation precedes you, Captain. The warrior caste speaks of you with great interest. You fight with the cunning of a predator and the courage of the desperate. It is admirable. After the transmission ended, Torres turned to Sarah with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Another impossible victory for the books, Captain. The Admiralty will want a full report on how we took out 3 heavy cruisers with a single destroyer. Sarah leaned back in her command chair, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of the past 72 hours. Her crew had performed magnificently as always. In combat, there was no question of her authority or competence. Enemy commanders respected her tactical brilliance. Her own people followed her orders without hesitation, knowing that her unorthodox methods had kept them alive through battles that should have been their last. Set course for Titan Station, Commander. The crew has earned some shore leave. As the Defiance cleared the asteroid field and jumped to hyperspace, Sarah's thoughts turned to what awaited her back at the Academy. In 3 weeks, she would be required to return to Luna for her mandatory command review and continuing education courses. The same tactical brilliance that made her a legend on the battlefield would be dissected and criticized by instructors who had never faced real combat. They would question her methods, demand explanations for maneuvers that defied standard doctrine, and treat her like an unruly cadet rather than a proven warrior. The respect she commanded among the stars would evaporate the moment she stepped into those sterile classrooms. But that was a problem for another day. For now, she was Captain Sarah Chen, the human who had just humiliated one of the galaxy's most feared military forces using nothing but gravity, geometry, and the kind of inspired improvisation that made her species so unpredictable. The stars stretched into lines of light around them as they raced toward home, carrying news of another impossible human victory. The transport shuttle descended through Luna's thin atmosphere with mechanical precision, its automated systems guiding them toward the sprawling complex of the Galactic Naval Academy. Through the viewports, Sarah could see the gleaming towers and practice ranges where the galaxy's future military leaders learned their trade according to established protocols and time-tested strategies. She had been here before, many times, but the contrast always struck her. Out among the stars, she commanded respect through results. Here, surrounded by theory and tradition, she was just another student to be molded into the approved pattern. "Captain Chen, your reputation precedes you," said Commander Veltar, the Altarian liaison who had met her at the shuttle pad. His blue-scaled skin shimmered under the artificial lights, and his 3 eyes regarded her with what might have been curiosity. "The Academy instructors are quite eager to analyze your recent engagements with the Vraktar forces." Sarah adjusted her dress uniform, feeling oddly constrained after months in combat fatigues. "I'm sure they are, Commander, though I suspect their analysis will focus more on what I did wrong than what went right." Veltar's mouth formed what passed for a smile among his species. "The Academy exists to perfect military doctrine through careful study and incremental improvement. Your improvisational methods present interesting challenges to conventional wisdom." They walked through corridors lined with portraits of famous commanders from across the galaxy. Humans were notably underrepresented, their species having joined the Galactic Council only 50 years ago. Most of the faces belonged to beings whose civilizations had been waging sophisticated space warfare for millennia. "Captain Chen." The voice belonged to Instructor Thane, a veteran Centaurian whose 4 arms had once commanded dreadnoughts during the border wars. His gray exoskeleton bore the scars of battle, but his eyes held the slightly unfocused look of someone who had spent too many years in classrooms instead of command bridges. "Instructor Thane," Sarah replied, offering the precise salute required by Academy protocol. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Excellent. We have quite an ambitious schedule planned for your 3-week evaluation. Advanced tactical theory, multi-species command dynamics, and, of course, a comprehensive review of your recent combat reports." Thane's voice carried a note of disapproval that Sarah had heard many times before. They entered a lecture hall filled with officers from dozens of different species. Sarah recognized several faces from previous Academy visits, instructors and students who had made their careers by following established procedures and questioning any deviation from approved methods. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings," Thane announced, his voice amplified by the hall's acoustic systems. "Today we will examine the Battle of Carrion's asteroid field, where Captain Chen achieved a tactical victory against superior Vraktar forces through highly unconventional means." The main holographic display activated, showing a 3-dimensional recreation of the battle. Sarah watched as her maneuvers were broken down into component parts, each decision isolated and examined under the harsh light of academic scrutiny. Note how Captain Chen chose to engage the enemy in terrain that significantly increased risk to her own vessel. Thane continued, highlighting the asteroid field in ominous red. Standard doctrine clearly states that destroyers should avoid close-quarters combat with heavy cruisers, particularly in hazardous environments. A Rigelian instructor in the front row raised one of her tentacles. The gravitational calculations alone should have made this maneuver impossible to execute safely. How do we account for the captain's success despite violating basic physics? Sarah felt the familiar frustration building in her chest. These beings spoke about combat as if it were a chess game played at leisure, with perfect information and unlimited time to calculate optimal moves. They had never felt the pressure of incoming fire, never had to make split-second decisions with lives hanging in the balance. "If I may," Sarah said, standing despite protocol that required her to remain silent during the initial analysis. Thane's expression suggested he very much wished she wouldn't. "Captain, the evaluation process typically involves observation, followed by discussion. However, since you're here," he gestured for her to continue. "The gravitational calculations weren't impossible," Sarah explained, moving to the holographic display. "They were just too complex to perform using standard computational methods. Human pilots learn to feel gravitational interactions through years of training in Earth's asteroid belt." Feel? The word came from Professor Kethmar, an elderly Vegan whose species prided itself on logical precision. "Combat decisions should be based on mathematical certainty, not emotional impressions. With respect, Professor, mathematics and intuition aren't mutually exclusive. When you have milliseconds to react, you can't run full calculations. You have to trust your training and experience to guide you toward solutions that your conscious mind hasn't had time to process." The assembled instructors exchanged glances that Sarah had learned to recognize. To them, her explanation sounded like mysticism, a primitive reliance on instinct rather than proper scientific method. The fact that it worked consistently didn't matter as much as the fact that it couldn't be codified into teachable doctrine. "Captain Chen," said Dr. Zaranis, "the Academy's head of tactical studies, while your results are undeniably impressive, we must consider the broader implications of your methods. How can we train the next generation of officers if their success depends on uniquely human intuition?" There it was, the core of their problem with her. The galaxy's military establishment had spent thousands of years developing standardized procedures that could be taught to any species. Sarah's approach threatened that entire system by suggesting that some aspects of warfare couldn't be reduced to universal principles. "Perhaps," Sarah replied carefully, "the answer isn't to make all officers fight like humans, but to recognize that different species bring different strengths to combat. The Vraktar are predictable because they value honor and direct confrontation. The hegemony relies on overwhelming firepower because their society rewards displays of strength. Humans are adaptable because our entire evolutionary history has been about surviving in changing environments." The lecture hall fell silent. Sarah could see her words being processed by minds trained to find flaws in any argument that challenged established doctrine. Finally, Instructor Thane spoke. "An interesting perspective, Captain. However, the Academy's mission is to create unified command standards that can be applied across all member species. Individual exceptions undermine the cohesion necessary for effective multi-species operations." Sarah nodded politely, but inside she was already counting the days until she could return to her ship. Out there among the stars and the dangers they held, her methods spoke for themselves through the lives they saved and the victories they achieved. Here, surrounded by theory and tradition, she was just another problem to be solved. The evaluation continued for another 2 hours, with each of her tactical decisions dissected and questioned. By the end, Sarah felt as if she had been defending herself at a court-martial rather than participating in a professional development exercise. The simulation chamber hummed with energy as Sarah stepped into the holographic environment. Around her, the familiar bridge of a standard galactic Navy destroyer materialized, complete with control stations for various alien species. The Academy prided itself on these training scenarios, designed to test command decisions in carefully controlled situations. Today's exercise will evaluate your ability to command a multi-species crew according to established protocols, announced Dr. Kethmar's voice through the chamber's speakers. You will face a standard patrol scenario with predetermined optimal solutions. Sarah examined her assigned crew roster with growing dismay. The holographic officers were programmed to respond only to regulation commands given in the precise format outlined in the Galactic Naval Manual. Any deviation from standard procedure would result in confusion or outright refusal to comply. "Begin simulation," came the announcement. The tactical display showed a routine patrol route through the Outer Rim territories. Sarah's virtual crew went through their prescribed duties with mechanical precision, each action following the exact sequence outlined in their training protocols. Everything was predictable, orderly, and completely artificial. 20 minutes into the simulation, proximity alarms began wailing. 3 unidentified vessels had dropped out of hyperspace directly ahead, their energy signatures matching known pirate configurations. The scenario was clearly designed to test her adherence to standard anti-piracy procedures. Tactical. Identify hostile vessels and recommend engagement protocols, Sarah ordered, following the expected command structure. 3 modified freighters with military-grade weapons, reported the holographic Ridiculed tactical officer. Recommend Protocol 7 Alpha. Maintain defensive posture while broadcasting surrender demands. Sarah almost laughed. Protocol 7 Alpha had been written by committee, designed to minimize casualties and diplomatic incidents. It assumed that pirates were rational actors who would retreat when faced with superior firepower. In her real-world experience, pirates were usually desperate enough to fight anything short of a battleship. "Helm, implement evasive pattern Delta 4, she commanded, testing the system's flexibility. "Pattern Delta 4 is not recommended for this scenario," replied the virtual pilot, a young Centaurian programmed to question any deviation from approved doctrine. "Standard protocol calls for maintaining position to demonstrate resolve." Through the observation window, Sarah could see her Academy evaluators taking notes. This was exactly what they wanted to see. A captain struggling with the limitations of rigid procedure, demonstrating why personal initiative should be subordinated to established command structures. The pirate ships began their attack run, energy weapons charging with the distinctive whine that preceded combat. In a real engagement, Sarah would already be maneuvering to exploit their formation weaknesses while coordinating with her crew through the rapid, informal communication style that had kept them alive through dozens of battles. Instead, she was forced to watch as her virtual crew followed each step of the anti-piracy checklist with maddening precision. First, broadcast warnings, then attempt to disable rather than destroy. Finally, request backup while maintaining defensive posture. "Captain," said the holographic communications officer, a vegan whose species valued logic above all else, "the hostile vessels are not responding to surrender demands. Protocol 7 Alpha calls for escalation to 7 Beta. Sarah gritted her teeth. Protocol 7 Beta involved filing a formal complaint with the nearest galactic patrol station and requesting mediation services. The bureaucrats who had written these procedures clearly believed that all conflicts could be resolved through proper paperwork and diplomatic channels. "Weapons. Prepare for defensive fire only," she commanded, knowing that the real pirates surrounding them wouldn't be so restrained. The engagement that followed was a perfect demonstration of everything wrong with Academy doctrine. Her virtual crew responded to each threat methodically, checking and double-checking their actions against regulation procedures while the enemy ships darted around them like angry wasps. The simulation's pirates, programmed to exploit exactly these weaknesses, concentrated their fire on the destroyer's engines while the weapons crew waited for formal authorization to return fire. "Hull breach on Deck 7, reported the damage control officer with artificial calm. "Recommend initiating Protocol 12 Gamma for emergency repairs." Protocol 12 Gamma required a formal damage assessment, written reports from all affected departments, and approval from no fewer than 3 senior officers before beginning repairs. Sarah watched helplessly as her ship's condition continued to deteriorate, while her crew followed proper channels. In the observation booth, she could see Dr. Kethmar and his colleagues nodding approvingly. The simulation was proceeding exactly as designed, demonstrating the chaos that resulted when commanding officers failed to follow established procedures. The fact that those same procedures were leading to certain defeat seemed to be beside the point. "Captain," said her first officer, a holographic Altarian whose blue scales flickered with stress patterns, "enemy vessels are preparing to board. Protocol 7 Delta recommends activating emergency beacon and preparing to surrender vessel to prevent unnecessary casualties. That was the final straw. Sarah had watched real friends die because commanders were too rigid to adapt when circumstances changed. She had seen brilliant tactical opportunities wasted because someone insisted on following procedures written by beings who had never faced combat. The Academy might value conformity over results, but she couldn't bring herself to fail this scenario through deliberate incompetence. All crew, this is the captain, Sarah announced over the ship's internal communications. Disregard all previous protocols. We're switching to emergency combat procedures. Helm, implement attack pattern Chen 7. Weapons, target their engine assemblies with concentrated fire. Engineering, reroute all available power to forward shields. The simulation paused for several seconds as its programming struggled to process commands that didn't exist in its database. Finally, error messages began appearing on various displays as the virtual crew attempted to execute orders that violated their fundamental programming. "Captain," said the tactical officer with obvious confusion, "attack pattern Chen 7 is not in our tactical database. Please specify approved engagement pattern." "Then improvise," Sarah snapped. "Use the gravity well from that nearby asteroid to slingshot around behind them. Concentrate fire on the lead ship's weakest shield facings. Move like you want to stay alive instead of like you're following a checklist." More error messages cascaded across the displays as the simulation's artificial intelligence struggled to reconcile Sarah's creative tactics with its rigid programming. The holographic crew began exhibiting glitches, their responses becoming increasingly erratic as the system tried to force her commands into approved frameworks. Finally, the simulation crashed completely, leaving Sarah standing alone in an empty chamber filled with flickering error holograms. The door hissed open, and Dr. Kethmar entered, his expression a mixture of disappointment and vindication. Behind him, the other evaluators looked like professors who had just watched a student deliberately fail an examination. "Captain Chen," Kethmar said with the patience of someone addressing a particularly slow child, "you have just demonstrated precisely why individual innovation must be subordinated to collective doctrine. Your improvised tactics not only violated established procedures but actually broke the simulation itself." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "The simulation broke because it was designed to reward failure and punish success. In a real engagement, those pirates would have destroyed my ship while my crew was busy filing proper reports." "Perhaps," the professor acknowledged, "but in a real multi-species fleet, your improvised tactics would have resulted in complete chaos as different crews attempted to implement procedures they had never trained for." The fundamental disconnect was clear to Sarah now. The Academy saw warfare as a problem to be solved through standardization and control. She saw it as a dynamic challenge requiring constant adaptation and innovation. Neither perspective was entirely wrong, but they were completely incompatible. The Academy's recreation center buzzed with quiet conversation as officers from across the galaxy shared meals and exchanged stories. Sarah sat alone at a corner table, picking at her synthesized Earth cuisine while reviewing the day's humiliating evaluations. 3 weeks of this systematic deconstruction, and she still had 10 days remaining. "Captain Chen," the voice belonged to a young human ensign, barely out of basic training by the look of him. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am, but I was wondering if I could ask you something." Sarah looked up from her meal, noting the eager expression on the young man's face. Ensign Marcus Webb, according to his name tag, probably fresh from Earth and full of the same aggressive confidence that had made their species simultaneously feared and ridiculed among galactic military circles. "Sit down, Ensign. What's on your mind?" Webb slid into the opposite chair, glancing nervously around the dining area. "Ma'am, I've been following your career since the Academy lectures began. The instructors keep saying your methods are wrong, but your results speak for themselves. How do you deal with the constant criticism?" It was a fair question, one that Sarah had been asking herself for years. "The truth is, Webb, sometimes I wonder if they're right. Maybe there is something to be said for predictable, standardized tactics. They certainly make command decisions easier when you don't have to constantly improvise. But ma'am, with respect, standardized tactics get people killed. I've read the battle reports from ships that followed doctrine exactly. Their casualty rates are 3 times higher than vessels commanded by officers who adapt to circumstances." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You've been doing research?" "Yes, ma'am." Human tactical flexibility isn't just effective, it's revolutionary. We approach warfare differently than any other species in the galaxy. The Vraktar fight for honor, the hegemony fights for dominance, the Centaurians fight for order. We fight to win, by any means necessary. Before Sarah could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the approach of Commander Zefra, a Rigellian officer whose tentacles writhed with barely contained irritation. Her species was known for their logical precision and deep resentment of anything that challenged established order. "Captain Chen," Zefra said, her translation device rendering her words in clipped, formal tones. "I couldn't help but overhear your discussion. Perhaps you could explain to Ensign Webb why individual initiative undermines fleet cohesion?" Sarah set down her fork, recognizing the challenge in the commander's posture. Around them, other conversations had begun to quiet as officers from various species turned their attention to what promised to be an interesting debate. Commander Zefra, "I'd argue that rigid adherence to doctrine is what undermines fleet effectiveness. When every ship responds to threats in exactly the same way, the entire formation becomes predictable. Predictability allows for coordination," Zefra countered, her tentacles forming what Sarah had learned to recognize as dismissive gestures. When the 15th Fleet engaged the hegemony at Proxima, their victory was achieved through precise execution of approved tactical patterns. Every ship knew exactly what every other ship would do. And when those same patterns were used against the hegemony's Southern Fleet 3 months later? Sarah asked quietly. Zefra's tentacles stilled. The Southern Fleet engagement had been a disaster, with galactic forces walking into a carefully prepared trap that exploited their predictable tactical responses. 18 ships lost because enemy commanders had studied Academy doctrine and learned to counter it. "That was an exceptional circumstance," Zefra said after a moment. "Every combat situation is an exceptional circumstance," Sarah replied. "The moment you assume your enemy will behave according to your expectations, you've already lost the initiative." A new voice joined the conversation as Commander Veltar approached their table. The Altarian's blue scales shimmered with the color patterns that indicated deep thought among his species. "An interesting perspective, Captain Chen. But consider this. If every commander improvises independently, how can fleet movements be coordinated? How can supply lines be maintained? How can reinforcements be deployed effectively?" It was the same argument Sarah had heard dozens of times, and it contained enough truth to be genuinely challenging. Large-scale military operations did require coordination and planning. The question was whether that coordination had to come at the expense of tactical flexibility. "Commander Veltar raises an important point," said Dr. Thorne, an elderly human professor who had been observing the discussion from a nearby table. Unlike most Academy instructors, Thorne had actually commanded ships in combat before transitioning to education. "However, I would suggest that coordination and improvisation aren't mutually exclusive." Sarah looked at the professor with surprise. Thorne had been one of her harshest critics during the evaluation sessions, questioning every deviation from standard procedure. "During the siege of Vega Prime," Thorne continued, "I commanded a destroyer squadron tasked with breaking through hegemony lines. Our initial approach followed standard fleet doctrine and was completely ineffective. The enemy had studied our patterns and positioned their forces accordingly. The dining area had grown quiet now, with officers from across the galaxy listening to the impromptu tactical discussion. Thorne's words carried weight due to his reputation as both a scholar and a veteran. "Captain Chen was a lieutenant on one of my ships at the time," Thorne said, nodding toward Sarah. "She suggested a completely unorthodox approach using the planet's magnetic field to mask our approach while implementing individual attack patterns based on each ship's specific capabilities." "Ensign." Webb leaned forward eagerly. "What happened, sir?" "We achieved complete tactical surprise and broke through their lines with minimal casualties. More importantly, when the hegemony attempted to counter our new tactics in subsequent engagements, they failed because we weren't using a standardized pattern they could study and exploit." "Commander." Zefra's tentacles had begun, the rapid writhing that indicated cognitive dissonance among her species. "But Professor Thorne, you've spent the last 3 weeks criticizing Captain Chen's unorthodox methods in your lectures." Thorne's smile was rueful. "Because the Academy requires me to teach approved doctrine, not effective tactics. There's often a significant difference between the two." The admission sent ripples of shock through the assembled officers. Here was a respected academy instructor openly acknowledging that official doctrine might be flawed. The truth is, Thorne continued, Captain Chen represents something that terrifies the academy hierarchy. She proves that individual excellence can triumph over institutional mediocrity. Her success threatens the entire system that justifies the academy's existence. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and unease. She had always suspected that her treatment at the academy was about more than just tactical disagreements, but having it stated so bluntly by a senior instructor was both satisfying and troubling. "So what's the solution?" asked Webb. "How do we balance individual innovation with institutional requirements?" It was Veltar who answered, his scales shifting to patterns that indicated careful consideration. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing between standardization and improvisation, but in creating systems that allow for both. Flexible frameworks rather than rigid procedures. Adaptive doctrine, Sarah mused. General principles that can be interpreted differently based on specific circumstances and individual capabilities. The conversation continued for another hour, with officers from various species contributing their perspectives on the eternal tension between order and chaos in military operations. By the end, Sarah found herself cautiously optimistic that real change might be possible, even within the Academy's traditional structure. But as the group began to disperse, Commander Zephyra approached her with a final comment. "Captain Chen, your ideas are intriguing, but remember that the Academy has existed for over 1,000 years. Individual reformers come and go, but institutions endure." The warning was clear, and Sarah recognized the implicit threat behind the commander's words. Change would not come easily, and those who challenged established order would face significant resistance from beings who had built their careers on maintaining the status quo. The emergency klaxons began wailing at 0347 hours local time, cutting through the Academy's artificial night cycle like a plasma torch through steel plating. Sarah bolted upright in her quarters, already reaching for her uniform before her conscious mind had fully processed the alert. Around the Academy complex, similar scenes played out as thousands of officers and cadets responded to the call. "All personnel report to designated emergency stations," announced the Academy's central AI. "This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Sarah was dressed and moving through the corridors within minutes, her combat instincts overriding the slow, institutional pace that normally governed Academy life. Around her, other officers hurried toward their assignments with varying degrees of urgency. The alien species tended to move with deliberate purpose, checking and rechecking their equipment. The humans ran. The Situation Room was already crowded when Sarah arrived. Admiral Korath, the Academy's Centaurian commandant, stood before a massive holographic display showing the outer solar system. Red icons pulsed ominously near the asteroid belt, moving in formation toward Luna's orbital space. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings," Admiral Korath began, his forearms moving in the complex gestures that accompanied formal announcements among his species. 47 minutes ago, long-range sensors detected a massive hegemony fleet emerging from hyperspace at the edge of our solar system. Initial estimates suggest over 200 vessels, including at least 12 super dreadnoughts. Shocked murmurs rippled through the assembled officers. The hegemony hadn't launched an offensive this deep into Galactic Council space in over 20 years. Their appearance here now was either an act of desperation or the beginning of a major new war. "The home fleet has been deployed to intercept," the Admiral continued, "but they are significantly outnumbered and won't reach optimal engagement range for another 18 hours. In the meantime, Academy assets are being mobilized for potential defensive operations." Sarah studied the tactical display with growing concern. The hegemony formation was moving with unusual coordination, their ships arranged in the complex geometric patterns that suggested careful planning rather than desperate aggression. This wasn't a raiding force or a probe, it was an invasion fleet. "Sir," called out Commander Veltar from across the room, "what are the enemy's probable objectives?" Luna itself would be a minimal strategic target. Admiral Korath's expression grew grim. "Intelligence suggests they're targeting the Academy itself. Our analysis and training facilities represent the institutional knowledge of galactic military doctrine. If they can capture or destroy them, they would severely impact our ability to train future commanders." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The Academy wasn't just an educational institution. It was the repository of 1,000 years of accumulated tactical knowledge. The loss of this facility would cripple the Galactic Council's military effectiveness for generations to come. Assignment rosters are being distributed now, the Admiral announced. Academy staff will be integrated with Home Fleet reserves to provide maximum defensive coverage. Dismissed. Sarah checked her assignment tablet and felt her stomach drop. She had been assigned to command the Academy training ship UES Determination, a destroyer-class vessel normally used for cadet exercises. Her crew would consist entirely of Academy personnel, instructors and students who had spent years studying theory, but had minimal combat experience. Worse yet, her immediate superior was Commander Zefra, the Rigelian officer who had made her opposition to Sarah's tactics abundantly clear. The irony was almost laughable. The Academy's most unconventional commander had been paired with its most rigid traditionalist for what might be the most important battle in Council history. 2 hours later, Sarah stood on the Determination's bridge watching her crew struggle through pre-combat preparations. The instructors moved with academic precision, following each step of the startup checklist with maddening thoroughness. The cadets were eager but untested, their movements betraying the nervous energy of beings about to face their first real combat. "Captain," reported Lieutenant Morrison, the ship's human tactical officer and one of the few experienced combat veterans aboard. "All systems show green, but the crew efficiency ratings are well below optimal. These people aren't ready for a real engagement." Sarah nodded grimly. The Determination's crew represented everything wrong with Academy training. Brilliant theoretical knowledge undermined by complete lack of practical experience. They could recite tactical doctrine perfectly but had never felt the terror of incoming fire or the desperate improvisation required when plans fell apart, Commander. "Zefra on deck," announced the ship's AI. The Rigelian officer entered the bridge with her usual measured pace, her tentacles already forming the complex patterns that indicated formal disapproval. She had clearly reviewed Sarah's personnel file and was not pleased with her assignment. "Captain Chen," Zefra said, her translation device rendering her words in precise, emotionless tones, "I trust you understand the gravity of our situation. With inexperienced crew and minimal combat capability, our only viable strategy is strict adherence to defensive protocols." Sarah bit back her immediate response. The Determination was exactly the kind of ship that would be slaughtered if it followed standard defensive procedures. Its crew lacked the experience to execute complex maneuvers under fire, and its weapons were optimized for training rather than serious combat. "Commander, I understand your concerns, but we need to consider our actual capabilities rather than our theoretical ones. This crew isn't ready for textbook engagements." Zefra's tentacles stiffened into rigid disapproval. "Captain, our duty is to demonstrate proper military bearing and tactical execution, especially in front of these cadets. Improvised tactics will only create confusion and undermine command authority." Before Sarah could respond, proximity alarms began wailing throughout the ship. The main tactical display flickered to life, showing dozens of red contacts moving through the outer system at velocities that suggested combat acceleration. "Enemy fleet has broken into smaller formations," reported Morrison, his voice tight with concentration. "They're moving to encircle Luna from multiple vectors. Estimated time to weapons range, 6 hours. Sarah studied the enemy formation with growing admiration for their planning. The hegemony had clearly studied Academy defensive doctrine and arranged their forces to exploit its predictable patterns. Standard defensive procedures called for Academy ships to form a protective shell around Luna, presenting a unified front against the attacking force. It was exactly what the enemy wanted them to do. "Commander Zefra," Sarah said carefully, "I believe the enemy is attempting to force us into a conventional engagement where their superior numbers will be decisive. We need to consider alternative approaches. The defensive grid has been established according to approved parameters." Zefra replied inflexibly, "Our position is optimal for coordinated fleet action." Sarah looked at the tactical display showing the Academy's defensive formation. 12 training ships arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, each one positioned according to textbook specifications. The enemy would be able to predict their exact locations and responses, turning the engagement into a simple matter of overwhelming firepower. Around the bridge, her crew watched the developing tactical situation with barely concealed anxiety. They knew enough about warfare to recognize a losing proposition when they saw one, but their training had taught them to follow orders regardless of personal opinion. The Next few hours would determine whether institutional loyalty or practical survival instincts would prove stronger when theory finally met reality. Sarah found herself hoping that her crew's lack of experience might actually work in their favor. They hadn't yet learned that some orders were too stupid to follow. The hegemony fleet struck with the precision of a surgical instrument and the brutality of a meteor impact. Sarah watched from the Determination's bridge as the first wave of enemy fighters swept through the Academy's defensive perimeter, their plasma cannons carving through shield generators with contemptuous ease. "Academy formation is holding position," reported Lieutenant Morrison, though his voice carried a note of disbelief. "All ships maintaining defensive grid according to protocol." On the tactical display, the 12 Academy vessels remained locked in their prescribed formation, even as enemy fire concentrated on their predictable positions. The UES Perseverance, commanded by Dr. Kethmar himself, had already lost half its shields while stubbornly maintaining its assigned coordinates. "Captain Chen," Commander Zephyr's voice cut through the bridge chatter, "you will maintain position and engage targets of opportunity, according to Defensive Protocol 77 Alpha." Sarah watched 3 more. Academy ships take critical damage while following orders that would have been tactically sound against a conventional enemy. But the hegemony had clearly studied Academy doctrine exhaustively, positioning their forces to exploit every predictable response. "Ma'am," whispered Ensign Webb from his position at the navigation console, "the enemy is herding the other ships into a kill zone. If we stay in formation—" "I'm aware of the tactical situation, Ensign," Sarah replied quietly, her eyes never leaving the display. Around them, the bridge crew continued their assigned duties with the mechanical precision that Academy training demanded, but she could see the growing tension in their movements. The UES Endurance, positioned at grid reference 7 Mark IV according to approved defensive parameters, erupted in a brilliant fireball as concentrated hegemony fire overwhelmed its shields. 43 Academy personnel dead in an instant because their commander had followed orders instead of common sense. "All vessels, maintain formation," came Admiral Korath's voice over the fleet communications channel. "Reinforcements are en route. Continue defensive operations according to established protocols." Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. The Admiral was ordering his ships to die in place rather than adapt to changing circumstances. Academic doctrine had become more important than the lives of the beings implementing it. "Captain," Morrison said urgently, "Hegemony cruisers are moving to flank the formation. If they achieve crossfire position—" Sarah looked at Commander Zephyr, whose tentacles had formed rigid patterns of absolute determination. The Rigellian officer would follow orders even if it meant the destruction of every ship in the fleet, because that was what proper military bearing demanded. "Commander," Sarah said carefully, "I request permission to implement evasive maneuvers." Denied. "Maintain formation integrity." Another Academy ship, the UES Dedication, took a direct hit to its engine core. The explosion lit up the tactical display like a dying star, taking 37 more lives that could have been saved by 5 minutes of unpredictable movement. That's when Ensign Webb did something that would have resulted in court-martial under normal circumstances. He turned to face Sarah directly, ignoring the chain of command that placed Commander Zephyr as the senior officer on deck. "Captain Chen," he said loud enough for the entire bridge to hear, "what are your orders?" The question hung in the air like an armed explosive. By addressing Sarah instead of Zephyr, the young ensign had created a command crisis that could split the crew's loyalty at the worst possible moment. Every Academy regulation demanded that Sarah direct him to follow proper protocol. Instead, she looked around at the faces of her bridge crew, instructors and cadets who had spent years studying warfare but had never seen its reality until today. In their eyes, she saw the same recognition that had motivated Webb's question. Academic theories were about to get them all killed. "All hands." "This is the captain," Sarah announced over the ship's internal communications. "We are breaking formation to implement emergency combat procedures. Helm, take us out of the grid pattern. Weapons, prepare for independent targeting. All departments ignore previous instructions and follow my commands. Captain Chen." Zephyr's tentacles writhed with outrage. "You are directly violating fleet orders. I demand that you—" "Commander," Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded in real combat. "You can have me court-martialed after we survive this engagement. Right now, I'm trying to keep these people alive." The Determination's engines flared to life as the helmsman, a young Centaurian cadet named Thyak, took them out of their assigned position with obvious relief. Around them, the remaining Academy ships continued their death march, maintaining formation while enemy fire concentrated on their predictable locations. "Tactical," Sarah called out. "Identify the Hegemony command ship. They're coordinating this engagement too precisely for independent action." Morrison's hands flew over his console with newfound urgency. "There, the super dreadnought at bearing 270. Heavy communication traffic and defensive escort pattern suggest flag command." Sarah studied the enemy formation, looking for the kind of tactical opportunity that Academy doctrine said didn't exist. The Hegemony ships were arranged to exploit predictable Academy responses, but that same arrangement created vulnerabilities against unpredictable action. Helm, plot an intercept course for the command ship. Engineering, reroute all available power to forward shields and engines. Weapons, prepare kinetic penetrators for sequential firing. "Captain," protested Dr. Thorne from his position at the science station, "a single destroyer cannot engage a super dreadnought. The mass differential alone makes victory mathematically impossible." "Dr. Thorne, you're absolutely right," Sarah replied with a savage smile, "which is exactly why they won't expect us to try it." The Determination accelerated toward the Hegemony flagship with the kind of reckless abandon that made Academy instructors break out in nervous sweats. Behind them, Commander Zephyra continued her stream of formal protests, invoking regulation after regulation that Sarah was violating. "Ma'am," called out Webb from his navigation station, "the enemy is repositioning escorts to intercept us. We're flying into a crossfire pattern." "I see them, Ensign." "Helm, use Luna's gravity well to slingshot around behind their formation. Weapons, wait for my mark before engaging." The bridge shuddered as enemy fire began to bracket their position. Warning lights cast an ominous glow across the crew's faces, but Sarah noticed something that filled her with quiet pride. They were working together with the kind of desperate efficiency that could only be forged under fire. "Captain," Morrison reported, "we're in range of the flagship. Kinetic penetrators locked and ready." Sarah watched the tactical display, waiting for the perfect moment when their trajectory would take them behind the super dreadnought's weakest shield facing. The Hegemony had positioned their flagship to coordinate the battle, not to defend against a suicidal destroyer attack. "Fire all penetrators. Maximum spread." The specially designed projectiles streaked across space at near relativistic velocity, their diamond-hard cores punching through the flagship's rear shields like bullets through paper. Secondary explosions rippled across the massive vessel's hull as critical systems overloaded. More importantly, the flagship's communication arrays went dark, severing the coordination that had made the Hegemony attack so devastatingly effective. Across the battlefield, enemy ships began operating independently, their carefully orchestrated assault dissolving into chaos. "All Academy vessels," Sarah broadcast on the emergency command frequency, "enemy coordination has been disrupted. Recommend immediate implementation of adaptive tactics. Repeat, disregard formation protocols and engage independently." The response was immediate and dramatic. Academy ships that had been dying in place suddenly came alive, implementing the kind of improvised maneuvers their crews had only dreamed about during theoretical discussions. The rigid defensive grid dissolved into a swarm of unpredictable threats that the Hegemony forces couldn't counter effectively. Commander Zephyra stood frozen at her station, watching decades of carefully maintained doctrine crumble in minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of bewilderment that Sarah had never heard from a Rigelian before. "Captain Chen, how did you know that would work?" Sarah's answer was simple, and it contained the essence of what made human tactical thinking so fundamentally different from the rest of the galaxy. "Commander, I didn't know it would work. I just knew that what we were doing definitely wouldn't." 6 months after the Battle of Luna, Captain Sarah Chen stood once again in the Academy's main auditorium, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of facing a panel of disapproving instructors, she looked out at an audience of cadets and officers from across the galaxy, their attention focused with the kind of respect normally reserved for legendary commanders. The holographic display behind her showed the tactical progression of the Luna engagement. But unlike previous Academy presentations, This one emphasized adaptation and improvisation rather than adherence to doctrine. The official designation was Case Study in Adaptive Command Structures, though everyone simply called it the Chen Protocol. The key insight, Sarah explained to her audience, wasn't that standard doctrine was wrong, but that it had become too predictable. Our enemies had studied our responses so thoroughly that they could anticipate our every move. In the front row, Ensign Webb, now Lieutenant Webb, nodded approvingly. His own rapid promotion had come as a result of his initiative during the Luna battle, and he had become something of a poster child for the Academy's new emphasis on independent thinking. Captain Chen called out a young Vegan cadet from the middle section. How do we balance individual initiative with fleet coordination? Isn't there a risk that too much improvisation will lead to chaos? It was the same question that had dominated Academy discussions for months, as the institution struggled to incorporate the lessons of Luna into its traditional curriculum. The answer, Sarah had learned, was more complex than either the old rigid doctrine or complete tactical anarchy. Excellent question, Cadet. The solution lies in what we now call flexible frameworks, general principles that can be adapted to specific circumstances rather than rigid procedures that must be followed exactly. Commander Zefra, who had requested reassignment to Earth after the Luna battle, had returned to the Academy as one of the primary architects of the new tactical curriculum. Her Rigelian logical precision, once used to enforce conformity, now helped create systematic approaches to controlled improvisation. The Rigelian perspective, Zefra added from her position as co-instructor, emphasizes that true flexibility requires deeper understanding of underlying principles rather than simple memorization of specific responses. When you understand why a tactic works, you can adapt it to new situations. Sarah smiled at the transformation in her former adversary. Zefra had initially resisted the changes forced by Luna's aftermath, but her analytical mind had eventually recognized the mathematical superiority of adaptive tactics. The conversion of such a traditional officer had convinced many skeptics that reform was not only possible, but necessary. Let's examine a specific example, Sarah continued, activating a new segment of the holographic display. During the Luna engagement, the UES Perseverance was trapped in a crossfire pattern with no apparent escape route. Using traditional doctrine, what would have been the appropriate response? Several cadets raised their hands, and Sarah selected a young Centaurian whose forearms moved in the formal patterns that indicated eager participation. Standard procedure would call for maximum shield power and emergency beacon activation while maintaining position to draw enemy fire away from other vessels, the cadet replied. Correct, according to the manual. But Lieutenant Commander Harrison, who was commanding Perseverance at the time, chose a different approach. Commander Harrison, would you like to explain your reasoning? The human officer stood from his seat in the middle section, still bearing the scars from Luna's aftermath. His ship had been one of the most heavily damaged during the engagement, but his crew's survival rate had been remarkably high. When I saw the crossfire developing, I realized that following standard procedure would guarantee our destruction within minutes. Instead, I had my helmsman execute a series of random evasive maneuvers while we used our mining charges to create an artificial asteroid field. Mining charges? Asked a Rigelian instructor whose tentacles showed patterns of confusion. Emergency supplies for asteroid mining operations, Harrison explained. Not weapons, but they create debris fields that can mask ship movements. We essentially hid in our own created chaos while the enemy wasted ammunition on false targets. The auditorium buzzed with excited discussion as officers and cadets absorbed the implications. Harrison's solution hadn't appeared in any manual because it required combining equipment and tactics from completely different operational categories. This is the essence of human tactical thinking, Sarah continued. We don't just use tools for their intended purposes, we reimagine their possibilities based on immediate needs. Admiral Korath, who had been observing from the Academy command box, activated his communication system to address the assembly directly. The Centaurian's forearms moved in formal patterns as he spoke. 6 months ago, this academy was nearly destroyed because we valued conformity over effectiveness. The Battle of Luna demonstrated that our enemies had studied our doctrine so thoroughly that it had become a liability rather than an asset. The Admiral's admission sent ripples of shock through the older instructors, many of whom had built their careers on the assumption that established doctrine represented the pinnacle of military science. Today, I am announcing the formal adoption of the Adaptive Command Protocol as standard Academy curriculum. Korath continued. All future officers will be trained in both traditional tactics and improvisational techniques. Sarah felt a mixture of vindication and responsibility settling over her. The Academy's transformation represented everything she had hoped for, but it also meant that future commanders would be looking to her for guidance in developing these new approaches. Captain Chen called out Dr. Kethmar from his position among the senior faculty. What advice would you give to officers who are struggling to balance traditional training with adaptive requirements? The question came from someone who had spent decades criticizing her methods, and Sarah recognized the genuine curiosity behind it. The events at Luna had forced even the most traditional instructors to reconsider their assumptions about effective command. Professor, I would say that tradition and innovation aren't mutually exclusive. The goal isn't to abandon everything we've learned, but to build on it. Traditional tactics provide the foundation. Understanding when and how to break those patterns provides the edge. As the formal presentation concluded and the audience began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by cadets and junior officers eager to discuss specific tactical scenarios. Their questions ranged from theoretical academic exercises to practical battlefield applications, and she was struck by the enthusiasm with which they approached these new concepts. "Captain," said a young human lieutenant who had been waiting patiently for a chance to speak, "I've been assigned to the Frontier Patrol Service where we encounter situations that aren't covered in any manual. How do we prepare for threats we can't anticipate?" Sarah considered the question carefully. The frontier territories were where the Academy's new approach would face its real test, in encounters with unknown dangers and unprecedented challenges. "Lieutenant, the best preparation for the unknown is to become comfortable with uncertainty. Train your crew to think creatively under pressure, encourage them to question assumptions, and never let success make you predictable." As the conversation continued, Sarah realized that the Academy's transformation was just the beginning. The real challenge would be implementing these new approaches across a galaxy where thousands of species had their own military traditions and tactical preferences, but for the first time since joining the Galactic Navy, she felt optimistic about the future. The rigid doctrine that had nearly destroyed them at Luna was giving way to something more flexible and more human. The Academy that had once ridiculed her methods was now teaching them to the next generation of commanders. The battlefield had always respected results over theory. Now finally, the Academy was beginning to do the same.